Youth Culture and Protests of the 1960s and 70s by Hannah Rogochevsky, Catherine Litchie, and Sophie Rosengarten. The USA. Why and in what ways and with what results did the young in the USA rebel? 1961 to 1969. The Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War triggered much of the student protest. In 1960, only 22% of young people were students, but in 1975, that number rose to 35%. Much of the student activism took place in universities. Kennedy suggested that peace and war, ignorance and prejudice, and poverty and surplus were major things to consider here. Many students followed this ideology. The Vietnam War. Many of the students wanted peace, not war. They wanted the government to pull out of this unnecessary war. In 1965, universities held teach-ins that included anti-war lectures and debates. Thousands participated in Berkeley's free speech movements. In 1967, MOBI, a major protest group, was created. Later on, in October of 1967, they orchestrated the March on the Pentagon, a major student protest that included the students marching up to the Pentagon. It ended up resulting in many arrests. The counterculture. The counterculture included hippies, and among that was sex, drugs, including marijuana and LSD, and treason, according to Reagan. There were also anti-war songs, including rock groups like the Beatles. Many hippies grew out their hair and lived a bohemian lifestyle. The pill was introduced, which was a female contraceptive, which helped to encourage extra and premarital sex. LSD inspired much of the psychedelic art and rock music of the era. In one instance, Harvard fired a college professor over advocating for drug use, including LSD, showing that this was a major issue among the universities. SDS and the New Left. SDS was the Students for a Democratic Society, and the New Left was a term used to differentiate the SDS from communist Old Left of the 1930s. The University of Michigan students established the SDS, which emphasized potential of the individual, which was stifled by bigger powers. Counterculture and the SDS often overlapped, and Yippies, which were a radical student group, were involved with the New Left, rather than the peaceful group, the SDS. Student unrest in the Democratic National Convention. In Chicago, in August 1968, the MOBI and the Yippies disrupted the DNC. Students threw bags of urine at the police, who retaliated with clubs and gas. Their actions encouraged people to vote for Nixon, who was against this student radicalism. Essentially, this didn't turn too much in their favor. The left had become increasingly extreme, and that is why such a major protest was held. Student unrest in the Nixon years. In 1969, a poll stated that 84% believed that student protesters were treated too leniently. In Kent State, students held a peaceful protest rally. The National Guard, however, retaliated, killing 4, and not all of them were even protesters. Some of them were innocent. Over half of Americans blamed the students for what happened at Kent State, even though the National Guard really was at fault. Nixon, on many occasions, sent in troops to stop student protesters, like in this instance. The results of student protest in the U.S. The New Left soon imploded due to the authorities not granting their demands and the dissolving of the SDS. Many SDS members lost interest when Nixon ended the draft, as that was what they were mainly protesting. Some retreated into communes or religion from there. Republicans, on the other hand, played on conservative fears, calling McGovern, who was a presidential candidate, the 3 A's candidate: acid, abortion, and amnesty, because he was not against those student protesters. It all ended with exiting Vietnam and a more tolerant society, as many think, though the exit may not have been all them in
Key debate: how new, effective, and widespread was 1960s student radicalism? Student protests, good or bad? Starting in the 1970s, historians began to analyze the 1960s. Many blamed student extremism for damaging the American liberal tradition. Veterans of the student movement wrote books praising the SDS and the New Left. Were the veterans' accounts accurate? There were various historical inaccuracies discovered within the students' accounts. The The students had also dramatized the differences between the 1950s and 1960s. Canada. Why, to what extent, and with what results did Canadian students adopt the counterculture? What caused the counterculture? The expansion of universities meant there were more young students who had little to lose. The unresponsive administration structures in universities made these students unhappy with their situation, and many of them were against the Vietnam War, which made them want to protest. Political activism. Political activism was usually focused in the universities where the majority of the students were. Many of the young people joined the New Left movement, which was critical on the current system but not clear on alternatives. Sometimes the activists were violent, such as in 1969 at Sir George Williams University, when students occupied the university for 2 weeks to protest racial intolerance. Students also joined the movement for personal fulfillment. Many politicized students were also hippies. Most were from a middle-class background. Some adopted the counterculture and lived in communes and took hallucinogenic drugs. Why did the youth movement end? Many were shocked and frightened when Kent State showed how brutal the authorities could be. Some joined more mainline political parties, and the students simply got older and had more responsibilities and not as much time to protest.
Next, we're going to talk about the youth culture and protests in Latin America. The Mexican student movement began with some student unrest, but it was uncoordinated with different motivations. As 1968 progressed, there were more and more protests that took place beginning in the summer. On July 26th, there were peaceful celebrations for the Cuban Revolution. However, it turned violent when police shut it down, and 4 died and hundreds were wounded. A national strike council was made, and protests took place throughout Mexico. As the government became more oppressive, the students became more radical. In late August, the biggest anti-government protest in Mexican history happened. This protest was broken up by armed soldiers and tanks, and many students were beaten, jailed, and some were even killed, which increased the size and number of demonstrations. On October 2nd, 10 days before the Olympics, 5,000 students demonstrated at Tlatelolco Plaza against military occupation of the National University, cost of Olympics, and the repressive riot police. The aims of this protest were not met, nothing was changed, the government was still thriving, and the Olympics still happened. There are different interpretations of what happened during the protest itself. Some think that students wouldn't leave, so the military needed to use extreme measures. The government claimed that students were armed and that the police fought back. However, 2,500 were wounded, and many said that the government blocked the wounded from going to hospitals. And according to the official reports, 43 people died, but foreign reports estimate up to 500 deaths. Thousands were arrested, and some people even disappeared. The government kept the details of what happened during the protest classified until the Institutional Revolutionary Party, or the PRI, lost power in 2000. In 2006, President Echeverria was arrested for the deaths in 1968. However, many thought that this was to deflect from the current president, Vicente Fox's corruption and oppression. The working class youth, mostly those who were from urban areas, took on rock and roll culture, and some students even became hippies, but the PRI worked to stop the music as they felt that it was disrespectful and ruining the generation. Some historians blame the demonstrations on the Mexican counterculture. Historian Zolov thought that student unrest was partly due to British and U.S. influence, including rock music and the rejection of traditional values. Additionally, border officials in Mexico were instructed to refuse entry to, quote, dirty long-haired North American youth, unquote. Many think that the counterculture was brought due to economic discontent and political discontent due to Ordaz stealing the elections. Students were sick of the PRI. They felt that Mexico was becoming a single-party state and that the PRI betrayed the idea behind the 1910 Mexican Revolution. There was also a youth movement in Uruguay. Students were an important part of the underground guerrilla movement called Tupac Amaru II, which was named after a leader of a large Andean uprising against the Spanish in Peru. The Tupamaros robbed and gave to the poor, exposed corruption, and over time became more radical, kidnapping and executing people. Their activities did make an impact. They helped collapse the civilian government, and an army coup took place in 1973. In Argentina in the 1970s, there was economic and political instability. This led students to participate in a guerrilla movement known as the Montoneros, who favored social welfare programs and robbed and kidnapped people for money. In 1978, the military regime crushed the group, and many of the students mysteriously disappeared. In Brazil in 1964, democracy came to an end when the military overthrew the government and the government became oppressive. A major protest took place in Brazil in 1968 when students demonstrated against the government in response to a high school student who was killed while protesting for cheaper meals for low-income. Industrial workers joined these protests. The government responded with even more oppression and cited the threat of communism as the reason.